The scripture is Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." This is the word of God for the people of God. So, as you can see, I actually made an image this week for the sermon, and part of the reason I did was because I'm filling in this week unexpectedly, and then I again am preaching next week, and then preaching again soon after that, and then one more time after that at the end of all this before my dad gets back. So you're going to hear me 4 more times. That's a lot. But since I get to preach so much and kind of back-to-back these next 2 weeks at least, I decided to talk about worship and not just make it like a 1-week thing, but something that I can talk about for a couple weeks. This week, I want to talk about the presence of God in our worship. And I chose these verses because I think it's a really good reminder of what our worship should look like and how it benefits us. So, another verse I'm going to use really quick is from Isaiah 29, verse 13. And it says, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is made up only of rules taught by men." I think that we do that a lot, and that's part of the reason I'm using that also. It talks in that verse about how we worship with our lips and our tongue and the words on the screen, the words that we sing. We just worship with the words. And we worship in a way that we have been taught to worship. We don't worship in a way that is pleasing to God, holy and pleasing. It's just something where we go through the motions and we read the words, sing along, and it's just done once we're done with the song. But I chose to talk about worship because I do think we take it for granted sometimes, but we also need to acknowledge what is happening during worship. There's a lot of things kind of coming together all at once to create this atmosphere that's a little different than we're used to. We need to not conform to what we've been taught, but be transformed through our worship. So that way we can figure out what God's good, acceptable, and perfect will is for us. And that's the idea of worship, the idea of feeling his presence, communicating with him, and being able to discern what his will is for us. And when we do worship, it can be life-changing. It's this spirit, this presence and experience that is pretty much indescribable. It's something that you just have to feel, and it's this presence of his that allows us to really know that he's there, especially when we worship. Worship is a really hard word to describe in itself as well. It's a hard word to have a definition for. And it gets talked about in the Bible a lot, and it has a lot of verses that relate to it and that talk about it. So I'm kind of using a combination of the verses that I'm going to use today to describe worship as an experience where we allow ourselves to surrender and sacrifice ourselves to God, that we're able to worship Him through our hearts, putting our hearts into worship, and worship Him through spirit and in truth. So, as we worship, we need to remember what it means to ourselves first. And worship originally comes from the idea of worthship, how much something is worth. So when we worship, we need to put value to God and His name and how powerful and amazing He is and all the stuff that He's doing in our lives. When we worship Him, it's not just, singing the music, but it's acknowledging who He is. It's acknowledging everything that He's done and everything that He will do for us. We need to acknowledge how He's changing our lives and be thankful and rejoice in worship through those things. Everyone looks different when they worship. Everyone does it differently. And that's all right. That's the point of worship. It's not about you have to do it one way or another. Again, that goes back to the Isaiah verse where it talks about how people have been told how to worship and they're not worshiping with their hearts the way that they should be. So whatever worship is to you, whatever you feel comfortable doing, that's what you should be doing. I know people who just, they sit down, they get on their knees and they pray. They don't even sing the songs. That's not what they're about. They're about the praying. I know people who just sit there, and even at camp, I heard this. There was one person who'd always sit down, and he'd look kind of grumpy every time he sat down. And I didn't actually know what was going on until Dustin ended up telling me, oh yeah, I remember that guy? That's how he worshipped. That's what he did. He'd just sit down, and he kind of bend over, and he was praying, but he just kind of, I don't know, he looked off, and he looked excluded. But for him, that's what worship was, just having that time on his own and communicating with God. And for other people, it's the idea of this being together as a church and worshiping together, being close to each other and connecting to God and to each other through that. And for some people, it's, swaying to the music. It's closing their eyes, lifting their hands. It's, for David in the Old Testament, he would dance. He got so into the music, he'd do crazy things and just dance his heart away. So whatever worship is to you, however you feel the presence of God, however you connect to Him through the music or whatever it is that's going on, that's what you need to be doing. That's how you need to engage through worship to God. For me, I am a music nerd, I guess. I blame my parents. But I think that music alone has some very powerful stuff in it, just without anything else. You can redo your worship songs to take out the words and just listen to the music, and I think that can be worshipful. I think they use music in the background of inspirational videos for a purpose because it makes it sound better. There's something to the chords and how it's composed that creates these emotions in you. And when you combine those emotions with the words, I think that allows us to bridge the gap and feel God's presence even more. But that's just for me, again, as me being more of a music nerd. I love Christian music. I listen to it as much as I can outside of church, in church. But there's so many different types of Christian music now. They've come out with everything, and honestly, if you didn't know that it was Christian or written by a Christian writer, you would honestly probably think it was something on one of the other channels you listen to. They have, I've heard, so EDM, if you don't know what that is, it's like electronic dance music or something. I don't know. I just know it's bumping, whatever that is, But they have Christian EDM, which basically is no words. It's just music, and it's just, I found this one guy that writes this music, and I went to his page, and the whole purpose he wrote it is because he started composing this music because he read about David and how he'd dance, and that's how he worshiped God. And he wanted the people of this generation to be able to dance and worship God through that way, because that's how they connect. That was the whole idea, was just as David danced, he wanted to compose this music for these people to dance to as well. So whether it's that or Christian rap, there's Christian rap now, and honestly, it's actually pretty good. Some of the stuff they write about gets pretty deep and personal even. So whether it's the rap, the dancing music, the hip-hop, the pop, however you connect, whether it's the worship music, there's ways to connect with God through the music. Not just here at church, but wherever you go. And for me, I listen to a lot of like worship music while I drive because, that's what I like listening to, and it gives me inspiration for sermons or worship whenever it is. But I almost get too into it while I start driving. Even on the way here, I was listening to Miracles by Jesus Culture. It's this song that's really awesome. And basically, there's not a whole lot of words in the chorus. It just says, I believe a whole lot. And I believe in you, and you're the God of miracles. And just like the simple words, but how it builds. Just even in the car on the way here, I was jamming and I was worshiping, and I don't know, my mom might have thought I was a crazy driver and start to close my eyes sometimes and drum on the steering wheel. But wherever you worship, you're allowing yourself to surrender and experience God's presence. And God is always with us. He's omnipresent. He's with us through everything. He knows everything about us. And it talks about that in a lot of verses. In Psalms 139:8, it talks about how he's with us in the heavens and in the depths. He talks about where he's with us through everything wherever we go. And that's the idea of God's omnipresence, which just proves how powerful and amazing of a God he is, that he is able to encompass everyone and everything all the time. However, worship has a different sense and feeling of presence that you feel God through. It has been called his revealed presence by some people, and it's a little different. It talks about it in Matthew 18:20, where it says, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I am there also. So it's the idea of how God is here with us wherever we worship, wherever we're gathered in his name, if there's two or more. And I don't think we've ever had church where there's been less than two people. So, you can even have worship with just two people, just playing the music, just you and the other person, whether it's music or whatever it is, just meeting up with someone. The idea of corporate worship, the idea of worshiping in a group as a church, allows us to see his presence. And again, it's a presence that we can't really describe. So how are we able to feel God's presence? How do we know he's here? And how do we worship in a way that allows us to feel his presence? In John 4, verses 21 through 24, Jesus is answering a woman who is asking him about worship. And she's asking about how their fathers worshipped on mountains and in Jerusalem, and how they should worship. And he responds to her. He says, believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. For salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. So, God is spirit, so we must worship in spirit. We must allow our spirit to connect with God and His Spirit and His presence here. And it's not about the music. It's not about the band. It's not about how good we sound singing. It's not about how good you think you sound while you're singing. It's about His presence and how you connect to God. And as I was preparing for the sermon, I found the story of how a church, they had a great band, fantastic, phenomenal, and they loved it. They loved having that band to lead them. However, they felt that their band was actually distracting from what the worship was, so they actually got rid of the band for a couple weeks and just sang a cappella. Whether they sounded good or bad, they sang and worshiped God in spirit and truth, just through their heart, how they're connecting to God, not through the words. They took the time to relax and slow down and listen to what they were singing about and how they could feel God's presence. In order for us to feel God's presence, we have to desire His presence during worship. And that's not just like, we come to church and we're like, oh yeah, he's going to be there because wherever two or more gathered, He's going to be there, so He has to be there. It's something different. We have to actually come and want to worship. We have to want to worship in His name, and we have to surrender everything to Him. And I hear stories of people all the time how they come to church, they want to hear a sermon, they want to hear the Bible, they want to learn about what happened to Jesus. They want to learn about the Old Testament, or they come to small groups, and that's what they want to do. They want to study again, but they don't really understand what's the point of worship. Right? I mean, we come to church on Sunday, we want to hear the sermon, not the music. That's not what it's about, right? But the two work together. You can't just come and study the Word, and that's great that you understand everything, because it's a lot to understand. But the point is, you can come and you can study, but you'll never have this experience with God, this connection. You will never feel His presence. And then how do you apply what you've learned if you haven't felt His presence, if you haven't connected with Him? The goal of worship is that it allows us to come into this presence, this connection with God. And we have to desire that in order to feel it. We need this encounter where we're not just worshiping through the words, we're not just worshiping with our lips, and because this is how we've been taught to worship, but worshiping with our hearts and spirit and truth, connecting to God. We can't just feel obligated to come and sing the words on the screen. We need to anticipate and long for God. We can't just expect Him to answer the prayers the way we expect Him to. We have to anticipate Him, and we have to look for how He changes our lives and changes the people around us. And when we look for that, we have to be understanding that our God is mysterious and powerful, and He doesn't answer necessarily the way we expect Him to. We pray a lot, and we ask for Him to solve this problem this way because that's what we think we need. However, oftentimes I feel like He ends up answering in a completely unexpected way. And we almost don't even think of that as an answer at first. We're like, okay, well, that just happened. No normal everyday things. And we pass it off as a coincidence. But the thing is, when we look for God's changes, when we look for the God sightings, we have to be open-minded to that. I was told last week, I was out of town. I was on a leadership thing in Bloomfield, Iowa, and we spent a couple days there. we were studying and preparing for this next year and being able to lead the youth over at Oakwood. Sunday morning, though, we went to the service there, and they had a brother and sister who gave their testimonies together. The sister, she really kind of struggled with, her relationship with God. And she passed off a lot of things as just coincidences. She didn't really see them as how God's working in her life. But her brother told her later, he said, if you even think it's God, don't second guess it. If you even think it's God, it is God. And that's what we have to look for in worship. We shouldn't second guess how we see him or want to see him. We shouldn't second guess our expectations of him, because he is something we will never be able to understand. He has this view of everything that we will never be able to comprehend. And when we worship, we need to be mindful of how we're going to experience his presence in worship. And I've seen a lot of little things and big things happen in worship where it's like, man, that thing's little, and that could just maybe be a coincidence, but you know that those two things coming together, there's no way that it was a coincidence. That was truly God's presence there in your worship. And he does a lot of powerful things through worship. As I did more reading about the idea of God's presence in our worship, I found this little excerpt where one lady who travels a lot says she talks to people on the planes or wherever she's traveling, however she's traveling, and she asks them, about God and their faith and stuff, and she says she hears the words, yeah, well, I tried reading the Bible, but that wasn't for me. It's too old to understand, too hard to understand, not my thing. She says she hears the words, yeah, I tried going to church, but that wasn't my thing. And, I didn't connect there. That's not where I belong. But she says she's never heard anyone say that they've felt the presence of God and said that wasn't for them. She says every time that someone's experienced the presence of God, there's no looking back, that that's what they want, that presence is unexplainable and powerful, and worship is how we're able to experience his presence. This is how we're able to connect with God. If we allow ourselves to be open to God during worship, if we allow ourselves to be living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, that we don't worship with just our words, but we worship with our heart and in spirit and in truth, then we will experience God's revealed presence through worship. We will experience how he's changing our lives. We will experience and hear what he wants us to do, and we'll be able to go and do it. We will allow ourselves to experience God in a way we haven't experienced him before. And as we take our worship for granted, usually, the idea of this sermon series is to allow ourselves to not do that. That we allow ourselves to use this experience every week to experience God, to feel his presence. That it fills us up and allows us to go out every week, allows us to change the lives of the people around us. It allows us to have his presence with us throughout the week. That it allows us to relax and be prepared for whatever stressful things we may be experiencing outside the church, and that we're able to even worship outside the church, whether it's in the car or at home, whether you're cleaning or driving or in the shower, however you want to worship and sing or pray, whatever you do, offer yourself as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Be transformed. Feel his presence. And be open-minded.